Hello, welcome to another episode of our podcast. Our today's guest is Ian Bancroft. Ian is a diplomat, but also a writer and author of a book titled Dragon's Teeth, Tales from North Kosovo. Okay, did I say it right?
That's correct.
Ian, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us, although you're probably having a really busy schedule.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to answer some tasking questions about the book.
Thank you. So, Ian, your book covers a whole range of events related to north of Kosovo. Looking at the time frame, it covers almost a whole century of north of Kosovo and all of the ups and downs throughout that years. And what I really personally liked is the fact that you made the effort to try to explain some of the things through the human perspective, through the perspective of the Serbian community, the Albanian community, the international one, and just like trying to explain that we are people like all of the others. And as one of your interlocutors said, Bane Nešević, actually that we are people of flesh and blood just like anybody else. But what actually motivated you to write this book?
Well, I lived and worked in the north of Kosovo for 4 years, almost 4 years. I was ULEX's coordinator for the north, and I know that ULEX at certain junctures hasn't had the best reputation here and could maybe be accused of people of not seeing those in the north of people of flesh and blood. The thing about this sort of work is it's remarkably privileged in many ways. You get access to people, you get to travel, you get to go to the monasteries, visit the green border boundaries, places like Leposavić, Zubin Potok. You meet politicians, but you also live within the community. You meet people from all walks of life. I often said to people when they ask me, what do? I said, I come to listen, to try to empathize, to try to understand. And of course, when you go to a monastery and you ask about the security situation, you get 3 or 4 minutes of that, and then you move on to the fascinating history of Banjska, of Sokolica, of the historic challenges, of the more recent challenges. So it's incredible. When people ask me, how did I write a book and work? One builds upon the other, basically. You hear a lot of anecdotes, you hear a lot of insight, and the real power of the book, as you say in the introduction, is the voice of others. It's not my own voice; it's the voice of the people I had the pleasure of talking to, and it's not just those voices that are directly quoted, but it's the people who are constantly shaping, understandings about what has gone on in the north, what is going on, and what the sort of future outlook is. So just as important are those people who were constantly around me, the conversations over dinner or at home, and we were quite embedded in the community here. So it's even those voices that aren't directly quoted who are just as important in terms of shaping my understanding about the place. And even though it's a small context, there is, as you said, there's such a diversity of stories. About Trepča, about, this is a university town. I notice now that the town is a lot quieter for various reasons. Students who can't enter Kosovo because maybe they're not vaccinated or it's holiday time or whatever. And you then start to appreciate what sort of life and energy the students bring to this place. You have the stories around the main bridge. You have stories about, the parallel or existing institutions that have existed. Of course, there's the political dynamics. You say I covered a century, but I think there are still, I realized from conversations I've had with people after the book was published, there's still things that are missing. And that's always a challenge of writing about such a place. You never really finish the book in one sense. It gets taken off you, sent to the publisher, sent out into the world, and then you learn even more on top of it, which is frustrating in one sense. Although I'm not an expert for the north of Kosovo, these are my impressions. These are the voices I felt deserve to be relayed and told to a broader audience. And as I said when I did a talk a couple of weeks ago, there could be a second iteration, a third edition, a fourth edition, constantly learning new insights. To be sort of self-critical. One criticism I received was that I sort of make this enormous leap from looking at the 30s and 40s and Trepča and the exploitation and the resistance and then the Nazis, the Second World War, and then jump to more sort of immediate times. And it creates I think in the eyes of some, it creates this false impression that all the problems stem from, from a certain juncture in the 80s. So I miss a big chunk of what happened during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, maybe. So there's a lot to revisit, but it is that sort of book. It's a constant sort of, dynamic of reflection about the North.
And why Dragon's Teeth? I mean, it is obviously clear to me, but let's explain it to those who didn't have the chance to really read the book.
So there are three main reasons. One is Dragon's Teeth for a sort of concrete fortification that was used to block roads. And of course, in the North, this has been a pretty well-used tactic at various junctures in the recent history. Second is the landscape. If you look around, you look out the window here, you'll see these teeth that I think, particularly when you're driving back from Pristina towards the north, and you start to see these. To me, they sort of resemble dragon's teeth. And then finally, the myth of dragon's teeth and sowing dragon's teeth, and this idea of conflict and the metaphor. So I felt it captured various sort of dynamics of what, because the book is a lot about resistance. It's a lot about community. It's a lot about the diversity. And I felt that name captured some of those traits.
And actually, your book starts, as you said before, with the beginning era of Trepča. And it was really interesting to me to read some of the unknown information about it. And that the main figure behind Trepča is actually Alfred Chester Beatty, and a man who actually salvaged 3 of the most valuable Serbian medieval documents. And the fact that we don't have any kind of statue about him, none of the streets has his name. But I was surprised that you started with it. Although there is a logic behind it, I believe that's because of the Trepča. But what was your idea when you started the whole book with Trepča and Alfred Chester Beatty and those kind of information?
Well, of course, given that I'm British, I was always intrigued by this notion of Engleska Kolonia and the heritage that you see, in the tennis courts, the bungalows, etc. So that got me interested of course, Trepča is so vital for many considerations about the north of Kosovo. It's employed so many people over the years. It's part of the heritage. It's part of some of the dispute over status. I mean, it's something that is constantly repeated. And I didn't know a great deal about the origins of Trepča. The archives are actually, or some of the Trepča archives are actually in my former university, the London School of Economics in London. So when I was back in London, I went and requested various documents, and it's fascinating. You get a whole treasure trove of maps and details and company minutes, and you can see what the research that was conducted when the concession was awarded, and coming and trying to learn where the old mine shafts were. And I'd never heard of this figure, Alfred Chester Beatty. It came as a great surprise to me to realize that it wasn't just that he founded Trepča, that he was a man of such almost global renown, the king of copper, as he was known. I never knew of this museum he has in Dublin, where he has this outstanding collection of manuscripts of not just, of Serbian Orthodox religious documents from the medieval period that he salvaged, but also from the Islamic world. I mean, it's a real sort of kaleidoscope of sort of world heritage that was put together by this one single benefactor. And I think the stories about him, and what was interesting also was the way that Trepča transformed the place in the 20s and 30s, how it connected this place to different, not just through, if you go to one of the Trepča buildings in Mitrovica South, you see these clocks with the different time zones. And that's because Trepča, of course, was trading with the world. They were selling minerals globally. And that's where it gave, Trepča pulled people in to this place, engineers from different countries, including the UK, people from across the former Yugoslavia. And then it gave it a more global orientation. So it has such a fundamental role in the way that people identified with Mitrovica and how they looked out on the world. And I found these stories of Alfred Chester Beatty, of the exploitation in the 30s, of the labor movements. These were labor movements comprised of all sorts of people from different backgrounds. And then, of course, this first act of uprising against the Nazis. where they sabotaged this aerial railway that linked, that basically took ore from Stari or Stantug in the south all the way to Zvechan and the smelter. I mean, this stuff to me was fascinating, but what also astounded me was how little people here actually knew about this. As I wrote, there is no statue to Alfred Chester Beatty. People know a lot about Trepča and can feel, and of course, many have relatives who at some juncture have been employed by Trepča.
Yeah, one of my closest relatives have been working in Trepča. When I asked them about Alfred Chester Beatty while reading the book, they were totally surprised, like never heard about him.
But even not just Alfred Chester Beatty, but the history of the labor movement, the history of the resistance to exploitation. As I said, the uprising against the Nazis, and then fleeing to basically the first resistance in the former Yugoslavia. I mean, these all happened here in the vicinity. Of course, you have the miners' monument up on the hillside overlooking the town. So it really seemed to me like the sort of natural starting point, because it exerts so much influence over different parts of life in the north. And as I said, it's a history that's sort of lost in many ways. It's a history that's neglected. And that's something that I felt was a good starting point for the book. The book was not supposed to be a comprehensive, it's not a history book. It has it pinpoints specific elements of history, but it also, turns a blind eye to many more. I mean, Beatty himself was more of a historian. I mean, I write about how he, despite sending these geologists and engineers, the advice he gives to help discover the mine shaft was that you should look for where the old church is, because the miners from the Saxon times, because the miners would pray before they go underground, understandably, given how dangerous the work is. So all these little facets of history, I mean, and as I said, you can still see the remnants of that period in terms of the architecture in Zvechan. Now, what people do with that, I don't know.
For example, one of the houses in my neighborhood, because I'm from Zvechan, one of the several houses are from that era. Mm-hmm. And my house is also from that era. So, yeah, they're pretty much there. Those 6 houses that were planned, they told us for the Brits, actually. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, they're still there, but a lot of them have been changed, reconstructed, and yeah.
And if you go down to Stari Turg in south of the Ivar, you'll see the remnants of an old hotel. I write in the book how there's a swimming pool still, abandoned swimming pool that has the diving board still in place. So there's a lot of heritage that has been lost, and it's not just heritage in terms of buildings. It's heritage in terms of things that form a core part of identity. As I said, the labor movement, the resistance to the Nazis, the sort of global orientation that Trepča brought, the people who came here. I mean, people came from across the region. And this is the nature of sort of mining towns. You go to Bor in Serbia as well. It's the same. You look at the demographics. It's a melting pot of different people, different nationalities.
What would be your most important part of the book and the favorite one, I would say?
I think probably the stuff on Bošnjačka Mahala is probably my favorite stuff that I wrote. It's much easier to write about events. So 2011 is an event. It's an event, yeah. But when you start with a blank piece of paper and you go to Bošnjačka Mahala and you're walking through the streets, and it's not that you have great architectural beauty that you can describe. You're really trying to pick up the way that people are going around their daily lives, what they're selling, what they're trading, the interactions, and whilst at the same time trying to understand how the history of the last sort of 20 years, the significance of the place. So I think that's probably my favorite chapter, because of the way, as I said, the starting point, trying to sort of contrive this. Because, this is sort of travel writing, but without a journey. I lived here for 4 years. So even when you're describing, the nature, you get to pick the season that you're writing about. You can write about autumn, you can write about wintertime. And so it's a case of trying to construct that gives color about the particular geography, whilst at the same time trying to intertwine the sort of political stuff and the historical stuff. And I think the chapter on Bošnjačka Mahala is quite good at doing that.
Well, And then with the rest of the book, you pretty much are, as you said, covering certain events. And for me, it was really interesting, the part on the barricades, because that was like a huge thing here. And also because of the, I believe, misperceptions related to this event. As I understood, you came here back in that time, actually?
I've been coming to Kosovo, on and off since 2003, 2004. Yeah.
Have you been in 2011 here?
I was here in 2011. I didn't see the barricades myself, but I was here around.
What were your first impressions when you came here, related to, especially to north of Kosovo and people from here? I believe that some of the things have changed now after those years.
Well, as I write in the book, I mean, one of the portrayals of the North always is that people are manipulated, that everything is either orchestrated or contrived, that people are either, if a mobilization it happens because people have either been forced through, their employment in public institutions, or they've been bribed in certain ways or threatened. And I think, what we see in 2011 is a really pure expression of why people wanted to stand up for their own rights, for their own dignity, for their own liberties, how they didn't want to. And I think what is important to understand when people talk about, borders not having changed, is to understand what the independence of Kosovo does actually mean for the realities of day-to-day life for people here. It's not simply the changing of the status of these lines on a map. I mean, it really has fundamental ramifications for the way people live. I think, there's in the chapter on the border boundary areas, I list all these banal smuggling cases. Everybody knows there's smuggling in the north of Kosovo, and there has been for many years, whether it's trees that have been cut down, or petrol, or worse, drugs, weapons, etc. But all the cases from the police reports were completely spurious things. I think chickens for fattening up, Coca-Cola, cabbages, pickled or fresh. It was normal people who were being impacted. People experience, every Friday queues on Yarin. I mean, borders, the erection of, there are fewer crossing points now where you can actually, trade that used to happen between Zubin Potok and Rashka and Novi Pazar. I mean, all those sort of relationships and interdependencies have been affected. And so, this is one of the reasons that I think people took to the barricades in 2011. Yes, because they feel strongly about Kosovo's independence, but also because they feel the ramifications of that on their ability to move freely. And so it was, I think, as I write in the book, it's sort of two competing interpretations of what it means to have, a notion of self-determination and freedom of movement, two competing notions of freedom of movement. And as your original quote about flesh and blood, it's been too easy often to just simply, castigate people in the north, to dehumanize them, to not look at their claims to be legitimate, to say that this part of Kosovo is simply a black hole or a nest of organized crime, and to forget that there are normal people living here, families, communities who are affected by developments. And that's what fascinated me, and the power of those testimonies about why people came out, why they took to the barricades, why they used their own bodies to block the roads. Even though it was a very tense time, I remember the confrontations with KFOR soldiers, and there were more malign elements, of course, involved in the barricades. That goes without saying. More extremist voices. There were those who had, their own criminal intent involved. That's undeniable. But that doesn't denigrate the fact that people came out also for very legitimate reasons to protest.
And when we were talking about the impressions, what was our experience? When I say our, I mean people from north of Kosovo. A lot of time has happened that, especially the international representatives, when dealing with north of Kosovo, most of the time they were just ticking the boxes, like putting figures into paper, while on the field nothing changed, and at the same time not really understanding what is going on. So from your perspective, is that our impression, or because maybe we are just biased by the whole situation, or is that really what happened? Because I have seen some of the critics related to the international community throughout your book also. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, Is that something real that we feel, that we think that has happened, that they didn't understood the situation and that they really dealt with some of the things only in the manner like to tick the box?
Well, look first and foremost about the security requirements that a lot of diplomats and international organizations have to follow in order to actually be able to come to the north. Many are still using armored vehicles. Many who work for international missions would live in the south of Mitrovica. Even within ULEX, there are restrictions on, we had a number of police officers. There would be restrictions on when they could come to the north and for what reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And it builds up a barrier. I was very fortunate. I got to live in the north. I speak some reasonable Serbian. It gets better later in the evening, or gets more liberal later in the evening, and had a chance to really become more integrated, to listen to a diversity of voices. Whereas for many, there's just this barrier of they don't get the opportunity to have access to people. And I think that's a great shame. And then that is one of the intentions for writing the book, because there are a lot of misperceptions about the North. There's a quote in the book about how describing the North as an anthill, which means that it looks formidable, but it's easy to crush. And that just represents a fundamental misunderstanding about the strength of the community here, for instance. Going back to the point that people stand up and resist and protest and voice their demands, not because they're manipulated or because they're told to, but because they do feel a certain way about what they've had to live through since 1999, 2004, 2008 in independence, 2011, 2000. There were various junctures over the last 20 years or so. And so there has been a weakness in terms of how the international community has engaged the North. I wouldn't go so far as to describe it as, dehumanizing, but I think it does start to have that effect. It certainly ends up putting the North into a category of people less deserving of our attention, less deserving of our, empathy or understanding. I mean, there's a very fine line between trying to understand the way people feel about an issue and being perceived as you're justifying why they feel that way. I've listened to a lot of people here that I don't agree with, but I can appreciate why they've reached that point of view. And then the point is to try and engage them and maybe persuade or just accept that is the way that they feel about a certain topic. And of course, I think there's also a misnomer that, that the North is the only problem, that if we solve the problem of the North, then it's the only last remaining barrier. I think this is a very, straightforward sort of, people like to put these sort of conflicts into very black and white categorizations. That if the problem of the North would go away, then everything else in Kosovo would be, solving the North is a panacea for solving all the problems facing Kosovo and therefore the region and Bosnia and everything like this.
It's the same thing with when I hear the stories about the crimes, about the švercovanje. What's the name, the term in English? Like sometimes it happens that they really portray North Kosovo as the only place that deals with those stuff, and exactly. The only place that it happens. While it is not like that.
No, and I don't. I think if you look at the crime statistics, I don't think you could argue it doesn't. I mean, I'm not a security expert, but you could argue at certain it doesn't warrant the sort of very heavy armored vehicles that people are using. I mean, we were driving through small villages in an armored vehicle. What sort of message does that send to people? That we don't feel that we live, we feel safe in their surrounding. But I think the other problem is as well, and is a lot has changed in the North in the last 5-10 years. When I think about the number of interethnic incidents day to day, when I first came in 2015, I think in the first 2 weeks I was here with ULEX, there was a stabbing case on the main bridge. I think now 7 years on. Even though there's a lot of political tension, even though there's a lot of, frustration and nervousness, I don't sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm perfectly, we can have a debate about these things as well. From what I see, there seems to be very few interethnic incidents on a day-to-day basis.
That's true.
There are some things involving young kids, they're teenagers, they have some responsibility, I suppose, but it generally involves young people. But even then, the last couple of years, despite this very difficult political situation, and despite, the issues with the license plates and the arrest operations, which were, really created a lot of tension and a lot of new grievance. Day to day, I sense that there's quite in some senses, a relaxed feel about, fine, the main bridge is not reopened.
Yeah.
But the main bridge also becomes this, again, another panacea, that if we open the main bridge, we've reunified the city.
Yeah.
I mean, the main bridge has its own perversities. You strengthen a main bridge to take lorries. I mean, who brings lorries into a center of a town these days? There's another bridge that you can use freely. I see many more RKS license plates in the north nowadays, and I don't see those cars getting attacked. Certain things have become just more normal over time. And I think that is progress that, the judicial system has been integrated. Obviously, the police were integrated many years ago. Civil protection was integrated. All those people who were serving for, the sort of bridge watchers are now receiving their salaries from Pristina institutions, ministries, etc. There is a lot of small-scale progress. But of course, I think the expectations of this Brussels agreement and the dialogue process were so massive. And of course, one of the main demands for the Serb community, the Zajednica, the association, hasn't been met. But I think, as you say, to go back to the original point, I think, there is one thing I hope this book has helped achieve is to try and at least broaden slightly understanding about that, the North is a complicated, it's a diverse place. The diversities are something also that don't come across. You talk to many, they have this idea the North is a homogenous community of Serbs.
It happened that like a truly multi-ethnic place, truly one, becomes it's a focus of media and public is on it. And at the same time, there are huge misperceptions about it. How did we became in that situation? Like, okay, we are having a truly multi-ethnic area and so many misperceptions. How come?
I don't know. I mean, I think maybe I find the same thing in Serbia.
Can I say it just like this? My opinion is that there is a huge thing when we're talking about political representatives, because now all of the tensions that we have, the most of the time, are on the high level. Mm-hmm. People like politicians from Pristina having stances they have, the Belgrade again on the other way. Mm-hmm. So I believe that there is a huge input from them. That's my opinion. You should tell me, what do you think?
I think maybe when you live within this sort of multicultural surrounding, like Bosniačka Mahala, maybe there's a tendency to almost take it for granted. It's normal actually for people who go shopping there to see two languages or to hear different languages being used. Someone made an interesting point to me once: the danger of talking about positive instances where people, cross certain supposed divides, even if they're not physical divides, but psychological ones, is that if you shine too much light on them, you may make those people feel uncertain about engaging in whatever relationship or dynamic And I find the same thing in Serbia. Serbia is one of the most, diverse countries in the region. You think how many national minorities there are. I think there are 23 national minority councils in Serbia itself. Hungarians, Albanians, the more obvious ones, but then the Bunjevci, the Vlachs. But when I talk to people in Belgrade, they're really not. They don't seem to acknowledge that their country possesses this wonderful diversity. It seems like a big blind spot that they're for whatever reason, so it's either one or the two. Either people are not aware or don't value it, or they just don't talk about it because it's normal. I think those are two elements of why this multicultural society, the multicultural elements that exist in the North, don't get spoken about it enough. Maybe it also. Maybe it also goes to the heart of one of the sort of sources of the problem, in that, this is about, the way in which the politics mobilizes people. It is about a Serb voice. It is about making sure that there's a united Serb voice. And that's what I think the penultimate chapter of the book deals with. This whole idea of strength in unity, or, how we're united. And political mobilization is about one Serbian voice. So it doesn't care for these, there's no real value in terms of boasting about how, what sort of multicultural environment exists in the North at all. It's more about making sure that people vote for the same option at each and every election.
Yeah. When you're saying about the unity, you meant in the terms that, as you said, everyone should vote for one party. You meant that,
electorally, there's no incentive to get. The parties here are grounded upon. There's no incentive to go and reach the vote of Bosniaks or Albanians. That's not how the political mobilization works here. And so, from a political point of view, it's about reinforcing, the loyalty to one political option over another. Which I think is something that I address in the penultimate chapter about this sense of, we need to remain united because that's what makes us stronger. And so I think that's another point that goes that goes back to why there's not enough appreciation of the diversity that exists. As I acknowledged in a book launch I gave recently, there's also, again, some other blind spots that I missed, in terms of the way in which, maybe looking more at the way in which the population of the North has changed at different junctures. A lot of people who live here now have come from elsewhere, south of the Ibar at certain points of time. 98, 99, 2004, possibly even, post independence. And then, of course, there are, those from particularly the Albanian community who left and haven't been afforded the opportunity to return. And then, of course, I write about the students and this constant sort of renewal of the demographics here. So it is a constantly sort of shifting consideration. But I think certainly the politics doesn't see an incentive in terms of lifting up and promoting, the openness of the North to minorities.
Yeah, I can see that in both Belgrade and Pristina.
Which exactly. It doesn't benefit their political calculations. It doesn't, maybe it's because they also feel it doesn't earn any diplomatic sympathy as well, which could be one argument. Maybe it's something that has been tried in the past and has never earned any sort of brownie points or however you want to express it, and it's not something that is brought into consideration in the present.
And what is really clear when I started reading your book is how the lives, the pasts, the presents, the future of two communities are overlapping, and how actually connected we are, the Serb and Albanian community, and that. But as you said, maybe it's just we take it for granted and we don't really think about it. Maybe. Well,
it's intergenerational as well. I mean, you have, the older generations. I think if you see, when I talk about Trepča, for instance, you see the older generations who were given the opportunity to go and study in Pristina, often through that relationship between Trepča and the universities. Then there's the language consideration, of course, which is an enormous one. It's not quite a golden age, but we are every year losing the people who can speak both languages, and there's not a new generation. Language rights are an enormous problem for the Serb community in Kosovo. Even getting good, accurate translations of legislation is extremely difficult. I mean, it really has a tangible impact on people's lives. But, as people over the, it's now people over the age of 40, 45 who might still speak both languages. In the future, we're going to lose that. And that's going to create even greater distance between the communities. Or they'll converse in English or they'll converse in German. I mean...
One of the researchers about the language in Kosovo said that the majority of youth is actually Serb and Albanian one when having conversations, they're talking in English, which is quite funny.
It is, and
living together but not really speaking each other's language.
Exactly, and it's gonna take an enormous shift, and it's going to take some leadership to encourage the respective, for leaders of their respective communities, to encourage the members of that community to go and learn the other language. For Serbs to continue to learn Albanian. But the problem is now, because there's fewer interconnections, it doesn't happen. I've met people here who speak Albanian and they say, well, of course I do. I was playing football in the streets, or we were sharing a classroom. So of course I speak Albanian. They almost made me feel silly for asking, but that's what the reality was like 30 years ago, 30 years ago. Whereas now, those connections are cut. Young people don't have the opportunity to learn the language or pick it up, not even have to formally learn it, not have to sit down and go through vocabulary and grammar tables, just to pick it up in the street or in the interactions. So that's a big loss. And when we're looking ahead to the future of how relations will be between the two communities, that's one element where you see them grow even more apart, even further apart.
Talking about the future, and one of the last questions for our conversation, I will quote one part from your book. It was, you wrote, for a small and seemingly insignificant territory, there is much to contemplate, including the prospects for future peace and reconciliation. It is related to North of Kosovo. What are the prospects? What are our prospects for future related to peace and reconciliation? What are your thoughts about it?
Well, I mean, a lot of what is decided about the North is obviously decided elsewhere. People here don't have a say. I think many people here don't even feel informed about what is being considered for the future. I think when the land swap was proposed, I think there were some surveys done that said a lot of people here actually opposed the idea. Now that doesn't mean that they support the idea of remaining within Kosovo, but nor does it mean that there are many good ideas coming to try and lay out at least. The problem is status monopolizes so many of these discussions, dialogue and status, when it comes to determinations about what the future will be. But what I said during a book launch recently is, the fundamental question, and it goes not just for the North but it applies to Kosovo and Serbia and the entire region, even countries in the EU, is whether people feel that they have a future in those communities, in those towns, in the countryside. When you see the demographic outflows from even places like Croatia and Bulgaria, that's the real fundamental point. And that's where, in a peculiar way, the sort of situation that persists here gives the North an opportunity to persuade people to stay. I mean, there is investment in the North compared to other places in other places in Serbia. There's, if you look at the east of Serbia, for instance, they're extremely neglected in many senses. So the North has investment. There is a commitment to trying to persuade people to remain here. It does make me wonder if the North, if there was ever a solution, however that solution may look, and then the North loses that focus, what would happen then? And I think that's why the university is so important, because it really gives. Trepča is important in one sense, but the calculations about whether Trepča can really be revitalized is a complicated one. But that's why I place quite a lot of emphasis on the university, because it really gives so much life to the North. And I think ensuring that persists and continues to bring in young people and new energy and I'd like even the North to acknowledge that more. And again, when we're talking about these sort of ways that things are valued and breed into the identity of the place, I think the university should really be a central point of that, because it's something that can persist throughout the decades. There aren't many towns in the region that have a university with thousands of students. So in terms of having an anchor that can continue to give the place a real defined sense of purpose, I think the university is quite important. Hence why there's a chapter devoted to the university. But I think the other advantage, if I can call it an advantage, people have lived through so much adversity here. I think they've learned to cope in many ways. I don't think it's easy to cope. I'm not belittling what. I think the strength of the community is a support network. I find it's remarkable the way that people can sort of insulate their lives. Not always, but for certain junctures of a day or a week from what is going on. Even if families have kids, they still find ways to not let these constant tensions and security incidents and uncertainties get the better of them. And I think that is a sort of resilience that I think gives me hope that the community will persist. There is an attachment to this place that I think it keeps people connected. And, but whenever people are talking about why do people leave, it's always about jobs and like provision of services and whatnot. And I think that's why this Idents is so important, because it gives that connection to that sort of institutionalized, transparent, formalized connection with Belgrade that will persist regardless of what Belgrade decides about Kosovo's status, whether, whatever that normalization means. But having that connection, I think, on these day-to-day issues like healthcare, like education, I think that also is important for giving, for people here knowing that they have access to healthcare in Belgrade if something, if they need, whatever, some treatment for cancer or whatever, I think is important for sort of looking at their surroundings and believing that they can continue to live here.
Yeah, even the question of Zajednica is disputable, because now people, after years of the first agreements about it, they're saying, okay, but we don't even need it anymore. Maybe we should stay the way it is. I mean, even that question is now getting like in the place that everyone is actually questioning it.
No, understandably. I mean, next year will be 10 years since this year. I mean, and from the original, from the first agreement. So people are understandably grow more skeptical. The existing institutions, as people call them here, or the parallel institutions that you'll hear them referred to, I mean, they still function. There has been integration on different fronts, but yeah, people still feel, the education system is important for people. The healthcare system is important for people. These are the things that you encounter day to day. These are the things that, matter if you have children in such a surrounding. So,
yeah. And Ian, just one more question. What would be your message, I would say, to, on one hand, to people of north of Kosovo, since you have wrote a book about it, message to official Belgrade and official Pristina, and maybe to the international community? I mean, that's like 4 messages. But what would be your conclusion if anybody asks you, okay, tell me something about north of Kosovo that you can tell to all 4 sides, and that like all 4 sides can take it into account and rethink about it?
Okay, 4 messages. Okay, let's go for North Kosovo. I think it would be to appreciate and celebrate the diversity and both in terms of the demographics and heritage that exists here, and hence why I write about things like Mitrovica Big Band. I realize the football club Trepča. I mean, there are a lot of the university. There are a lot of things to be celebrated here that people, I think. As I said, some of that I fear is being lost. So to find different outlets where that history can be kept alive and where stories can be told and shared. One point that came up when I did the launch of the book was that there's a lack of documentary evidence about a lot of these things. So for local historians to look back into these periods, I mean, you can't do justice to each of the elements raised in this book. There's certain practical limitations, but to try and find, either through collected volumes, to have more testimonies from things like 2011, things that have happened in 20 years. So there's a lot of conversations, a lot of people who write stuff down, but to bring it up, to bring it together. For Pristina, I think it's one of, and Pristina and the international community, I suppose, is the same, to stop stereotyping, to stop prejudicing, to find different channels for engagement, to humanize the North, to come and understand the complexities, to not, immediately presume that there's just manipulation and to have this very cynical attitude towards what goes on here. There is a vibrant community here. Now, it may not you may not see that articulation in terms of election results. But that doesn't mean that a vibrant community doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that people don't reflect upon the reality in which they live and the history of the last, of the recent years and the future orientations and outlooks. So it would be one about, humanizing and engaging with, and trying to open up channels. And for Belgrade, it would be one of trying to, I think, one of respecting the plurality of the way people think here. Not just in the north, but I think Serb communities all Serb communities in Kosovo. Partly because it's a huge pool of, ideas and vision and in a way sort of optimism as well. I think there were certain junctures where Belgrade was saying Serbs in Kosovo should learn Albanian, and that was within the last 6 or 7 years. Those were positive, constructive. For me, those are examples of leadership, coming out and saying, if you're going to live in Kosovo, it's really advantageous if you can understand Albanian for various reasons. And I think we need to see more of that sort of positive messaging. And for both Belgrade and Pristina, avoiding any tensions, because we saw around the license plate issue, for instance. I mean, for me, this is a classic case. For Pristina, it's a case of reciprocity. We've had to use Proba, now you have to use Proba plates. So it's pure and simple reciprocity. But yet for people in the north of Kosovo, it's whether they can actually drive their KM registered cars on the street. And you have two sides, three sides, multiple actors talking past one another. And again, people didn't understand the issue from the Kosovo Serb in the north point of view. They saw it purely in terms of, the reciprocity, that goes to the international community as well. So I'd like to see more testimonies from people about what the impact is of those decisions that are taken. And I don't think we hear those enough necessarily. But what does it mean, the changes to license plates? It's not just this, rhetoric about reciprocity. What does it mean in terms of, day to day for a family that owns a car that's registered in the Serbian system, and what can they do about it? And were they informed in time? What is the impact on them? And that, the failure to hear those voices really fuels grievances. And I feel sorry for, if I was living in this context, I'd be immensely frustrated and, feeling that no one's listening to me. So that would be a message for Pristina and Belgrade would be to avoid tension around these, divisive narratives and tension around these issues, because it doesn't help the people living on the ground.
Just like in these moments, we can hear a lot of...
There's a lot of understandable... Yes. Yeah, I heard, I've been here a couple of days and, people understandably, seeing war on their TV screens acts as a trigger.
Yeah.
Brings back memories and it brings back uncertainties.
Exactly.
There are a lot of people, it's not that, there are, of course, people who tragically are suffering post-traumatic stress, disorders, but even those who've lived through war, they tell me it acts as a trigger and reminds them of how things were.
Ian, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you very much. Can't believe we've done 40 minutes already.
Yeah. Thank you.